America's Cold War, Chapter 1, Part 2. If Charles Beard's reasoning, and that of like-minded observers, failed to do justice to Wilson's strategy, most Americans nevertheless had little doubt about where they stood on Wilson's legacy, not to mention the questions of becoming involved in another war. As late as the fall of 1939, after Germany's invasion of Poland made a new European war inevitable, and several years after Japan had begun its war of conquest against China, a majority of polled Americans continued to believe that the U.S. entry into the Great War had been a grave mistake, and that their government should steer clear of participation in the new conflagrations. During the general election campaign a year later, a majority of the candidates running for the Senate and House of Representatives followed this general line, as did the two major presidential candidates, Republican Wendell Willkie and Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who won an unprecedented third term. Yet, even as he campaigned, Roosevelt was quietly moving toward an interventionist position. The fall of France to the Germans in June 1940, and a campaign lasting a mere 6 weeks, made a deep and disturbing impression upon him, as it did on many Americans. If the French with their formidable military could not stop the Nazi war machine, who could? But as Beard and other critics of intervention detected, there were base economic interests as well as idealism at play. The United States was lending billions of dollars and selling and leasing goods on a vast scale, mostly to Great Britain, actions that went far to end the economic depression that had beset American society and much of the world since the Wall Street crash of 1929. Roosevelt was not above alluding to this economic advantage, as when he informed his audience during a campaign speech in Boston that the increased aid to Great Britain was providing the working class there and around the nation with jobs and affluence not seen since the 1920s. Furthermore, the president regarded the struggle between totalitarian Nazi Germany and the major European democracies, of which only Great Britain was standing by the middle of 1940, as a contest between liberty and tyranny. For this reason alone, he argued, the United States had a moral interest in supporting Britain. The brutality of Japanese conquests in China and elsewhere concerned him as well, but not to the same degree. Roosevelt was more skeptical than Wilson had been that the United States could reform Europe by dint of sheer example, and he did not share the former president's deep faith in America's moral purity. Scion of the old Dutch elite in New York and a distant cousin of an earlier president, Theodore Roosevelt, FDR brought to the White House a pragmatism that was forged in his climb to the top of the state's largely working-class Democratic Party. His tragic battle with polio and eventual confinement to a wheelchair, and above all, his Herculean struggle to end the Great Depression. But Roosevelt also had his Wilsonian side, which emerged as the European crisis deepened. Little by little, he began to see the New World War as a moral and geostrategic contest in which the United States must become involved. In 1939 and early 1940, Roosevelt seemed genuinely to believe that America could fight tyranny in Europe and Asia merely by providing economic support to nations like China and Great Britain. But following the French collapse in June, and more definitively following his own re-election in November, the president moved steadily towards the conclusion that the United States had to do more than act as the world's arsenal of democracy. It had to enter the war. FDR had come to understand what Charles Beard did not, that the world, and America's position within it, had changed since 1918. During the Great War, the United States was still a militarily weak nation, relatively speaking. It could not plausibly coerce European powers into accepting Wilson's vision of a new world order, even after they had endured 4 years of devastating trench warfare and slaughter. Wilson had been forced to rely on moral suasion at the Paris Peace Conference, with miserable results. The British and French, though they probably would not have won the war without America's timely entry in 1917, were unwilling to heed his post-war demands and proved largely invulnerable to pressure. The United States, for its part, could also afford to display some degree of intransigeancy, whatever that is, in 1918. Read the book. It remained as secure from the European powers at the end of the First World War as it had been at the beginning, even more so, given their post-war exhaustion. The idea that America could be threatened by a European state, implausible in 1914, was by 1918 absurd. Disillusioned by the cynical behavior of Britain and France at the peace talks, and unthreatened by any overseas power, the Senate, backed by a large chunk of the electorate, decisively rejected American participation in what Wilson viewed as the capstone of his post-war architectural vision, the League of Nations. Things were much different in 1940. On one hand, the United States was stronger relative to many other nations than it had been a generation earlier, despite years of economic depression and military isolation. If Japan, and especially Germany, were defeated, the United States would likely emerge from the war as the most powerful nation on Earth. The vulnerability of the British Empire, combined with France's shattering defeat in the spring and the continuing backwardness of the Soviet Union and China, made it clear to the president that if the United States participated in a war that led to the defeat of Germany and Japan, it would dominate world politics whether it wanted or not. In such a position, Washington could in all likelihood impose its democratic and capitalist institutions on much of the world, as Wilson had hoped to do, not by pleading with the European powers to accept them for their own good, but simply by giving them no choice. On the other hand, despite its growing strength, the United States was also now more vulnerable than any time since the War of 1812. Free security was coming to an end. The balance of power in Europe, the political mechanism that had divided America's potential rivals for so long, had just failed. By the fall of 1940, Germany controlled much of Western and Central Europe and had a non-aggression treaty with a wary Soviet Union. Soon Hitler could dominate the whole continent from the Atlantic to the Soviet border, with a completely overmatched Great Britain in no position to stop him. Moreover, advancements in aeronautical technologies had made the world a smaller place. A Nazi Germany that could bombard and potentially obliterate Great Britain's cities and navy could also send aircraft carriers into the Atlantic or operate from bases in Central America, with the aim of bombing American cities. In 1941, this remained a distant but non-existent possibility, whereas just a few years earlier, it would have been unthinkable. Did the distant prospect of German attacks on American soil really constitute an existential threat to the United States? Beard thought not, and derided those who imagined German planes from Bolivia dropping bombs on peaceful people in Keokuk or Kankakee. And even if Germany eventually attempted to bombard such towns, or even larger cities like New York or Philadelphia, this was a far cry from being able to conquer the whole United States. America was a continental nation, and to defeat it, a nation like Germany would have to deploy a vast army across the Atlantic and wage a war that could last decades. What Beer did not know, and indeed what very few Americans knew, was that a new technology was being developed which might make such an invasion unnecessary. During the 1930s, scientists in many countries, including Germany, had begun to conduct research into the possibility of atomic fission. The implications were huge. A nation that could successfully split the atom, these scientists theorize, might be able to use the power released by fission in a weapon of unprecedented destructive capability. And any country wielding monopoly control over such weapons could dispense with the problems of invasion entirely and simply threaten to destroy its enemy cities, one by one, until the adversary sued for peace. In 1939 to 40, neither Franklin Roosevelt nor anyone familiar with atomic science could have any confidence that Hitler's Germany would not build such a bomb and threaten to use it against the United States. Thus, while it is tempting to regard the atomic bomb simply as an American project that propelled the United States to superpower status in the Cold War, such a view would distort history. The Germans had their own scientific experts, and no one could be sure that they would not conquer Britain, which currently led the world in atomic science research. Just as they had already taken France, the Low Countries, that's Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, just for those at home, and much of Scandinavia, Norway and Denmark. Norway and Denmark is Scandinavia. A German scientist understood the stakes. He informed the German War Office in April 1939 that the nation able to invent the bomb first would have an unsurpassable advantage over the others. When Alexander Sachs, promoted by such leading scientists as Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, met with the president in the fall of 1939 to urge him to build the bomb, this was the danger he stressed. "Alex," Roosevelt said during their brief White House encounter, "what are you after? What you are after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up." "Precisely," Sachs responded. The president's reply was simple. "This requires action." And with that, the Manhattan Project came into being, conceived not in calculated ambition, but in genuine fear. Having issued the order, Roosevelt promptly ignored plans for the atomic bomb, whose production would not move into high gear until 1942. He and other internationalists in Washington were far more concerned with the shifting course of the war and their conflict with isolationists at home than in exotic new weapon based on advanced scientific theories that only a few people in the world would even understand, and which might, in the end, not amount to anything. What Roosevelt's 1939 decision signified, rather, was his general understanding that military technology was putting an end to free security. An adversary who meant business, as Nazi Germany surely did, could well be acquiring these technologies for itself, and if the United States did not do it at the same time, it could face a kind of danger that Americans had never really experienced before. For a U.S. president... For a U.S. president, these were uncharted waters. But was the United States really in mortal danger? Many American intellectuals, remembering the inflated rhetoric of 1917 and the ghastly casualty figures of the Great War, refused to believe it. Beard took the lead, demanding in every journal article and book he could publish that the United States stay out of the war, cultivate a peaceful social democracy at home, and let the woeful Europeans stew in their own problems. Before Pearl Harbor, Beard's position was difficult to refute. The monstrous enormity of Nazi power was not yet obvious. The ocean still seemed to provide physical security, and no one, apart from a few political and scientific leaders, knew anything about any atomic weapon. Perhaps America should stay out of the war. Reinhold Niebuhr, a Protestant theologian and political philosopher at New York's Union Seminary, worked to develop an answer to Beard. To be sure, America could probably remain physically safe after a Nazi victory in Europe, Niebuhr allowed. But the stakes had become much higher than in 1917. If America stood aside while Hitler seized all of Europe, including Great Britain, the United States would become the last major democratic state on Earth. Isolated in a world dominated by fascist totalitarianism, how long would democracy survive under such adverse conditions? Could the United States remain a forever democratic island in the sea of fascism? Recalling the ideas of the turn of the century, German sociologist Max Weber, Niebuhr, who I already said was Niebuhr, I believe, by accident, argued during the tense months of 1940 and 1941 that great nations sooner or later face a critical moment when they must choose to contend for great power or decline the chance. If they refuse to contend, they do not necessarily face physical defeat, but they do accept the prospect that their national identity, their civilization, will be influenced or even dominated by the nation to which they defer. For Niebuhr, the civilization at risk was not American, per se, but democratic. If the United States did not act, and Great Britain went under, democratic civilization could be doomed. Conversely, if America entered the war and defeated German and Japanese fascism, the United States could cooperate with Britain to establish democracy as the dominant form of political order on the planet. The time, for Niebuhr, was now. He recognized that in 1916, or even 1936, the moment of truth had not yet arrived, but by 1940 it had. Germany's victory in Europe allied with Japan's victory in Asia would mean the demise of the British and French empires, the destruction of liberalism and capitalism everywhere outside the Western Hemisphere, and probably the relegation of the United States to a minor regional power. This was a worst-case scenario. to be sure, and no, not one that could come true in the short term. But, free security would not end abruptly, and as a consequence, Roosevelt could face his decision to enter the war gradually. Distance still gave him some time. End of Chapter 1, Part 2.